Hello and welcome to the Centre Brexit YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our senior fellow, Dr. Stephen McCabe. So Steve, the government's controversial immigration bill was voted through the House of Commons yesterday. Labour claims that it will alienate many key workers who, of course, risked their lives during this coronavirus pandemic. What do you think this bill says about how the UK could look post-EU?
Well, I mean, quite clearly, if you earn under £25,600, then you're not included. Now, the reality is that many of the people who work in the NHS are on low wages, particularly the sort of the people working in cleaning, hospitality, for instance, and they are as vital as everyone else. And of course, if we've learnt nothing other than the fact that keeping areas scrupulously clean is essential to sort of dealing with a pandemic, then those people should be celebrated. I think it's pretty tragic, and it sends out a sort of signal that sort of this country is not open to those who perhaps do not have particular skills. I mean, there is also another argument, if I may say, that was justified by, or was put as justification, is that sort of Brexit would help to ensure that skills remain in the countries rather than poaching it. But of course, what we're saying is that if you've got high skills and you come from another EU country or any country in the world, then you are welcome. So it's a peculiar thing that I can kind of see the logic from sort of the Brexiteers' argument. I can see what they're trying to do, but it sends a sort of very powerful signal, and one that I'm not at all sort of happy with.
And the government has announced that Britain's farmers and car makers will be protected under a new post-Brexit trade regime. But do you think we can expect any more industries to be guaranteed protection?
Well, if I answer the question honestly, I mean, I can expect that every industry is going to claim that they're special. Quite clearly, well, farming, if I can take that one first, is essential because, of course, we've got to eat. We know that our car industry, or the automotive industry, was experiencing difficulties anyway, and of course has particular issues in terms of supply chain. What's interesting is that sort of the majority of cars that are made in this country are exported, and lo and behold, they're exported to the EU. So, in the sense of tariffs, will it make that much difference? I'm not entirely convinced, because I think that we'd have to go a long way to producing cars that are as good and as cheap as the South Koreans. Now, of course, in saying that, I'm fully cognizant that what would be nice is to get back to a state of affairs where we have a sort of a really thriving British motor industry making wonderful cars for British people. But do I see that happening in the short to medium term? No. Do I even see it in the long term? It's extremely difficult because, of course, component suppliers are all over the place. Anything can happen, but I mean, and coming back to farming, of course, we've got the difficulty at the moment in terms of farming that crops are not being picked because we're not getting the immigrant labour, which brings us back to the immigration bill. People who are unemployed, are they going to want to go out and pick crops? Well, maybe, because of course that might be the only employment available, but it's pretty tough work. And of course, it requires people shifting around. So, this is a huge cultural change. In summary, perhaps to sort of to wrap it up, you can see that the whole issue of the free trade agreement, or maybe the lack of it, I suspect we're probably heading towards a no deal, is going to introduce a whole lot of contradictions. And I hope the government will sort this one out, because it will, what I think it will do, it will make sort of goods more expensive, because of course we cannot compete against low wage economies, which I know of course is the justification of the Brexiteers in doing this. But of course people are going to be having to get used to lower wages, given the sort of the figures which we're just about to sort of talk about in a moment. So yeah, we will all suffer in many different ways, and maybe in a sort of another generation or so we'll all be better off. But hey, I think there'll be a lot of short-term pain.
So the ONS has released figures that show that the number of people claiming unemployment benefits in the UK soared to 2.1 million in April. That's up by 856,500. And there is also the concern that many people currently furloughed actually won't have jobs to eventually return to as well. Could we expect to see these figures rise over the next couple of months? And do you think it could actually end up taking years to recover from this?
Well, actually, I mean, I think the view amongst most informed economists, and I would include myself in them, is that we're not going to see a sort of V-shaped recovery. The idea we're going to bounce back. I'd love to think it may happen for the sake of everyone involved. I think that the lag on this thing and the sort of scarring that occurs will leave its mark. I mean, we're up to 5.8%, which actually in recent historical terms is high, but compared to sort of what happened in the sort of 1970s, more particularly in the 1980s, is low. We got to 10% then, and for those who were around at the time, they remember the famous song by UB40, a local group from Birmingham, 1 in 10. I suspect that we'll probably hit 10%, and it's then just a question of sort of how quickly we can get that back down. I mean, what I would sort of say is that I think there is a sort of not a danger in misreading these figures. It's not surprising that sort of many companies that closed down, and I'm thinking particularly in sort of hospitality and leisure and retailing. Yeah, of course, many people may be employed on short-term contracts. So, of course, claiming universal credit or unemployment benefit, as it used to be known, is very logical. The assumption will be if those sectors return to some sort of normality, and whatever that may mean, and that's still open to question, then those people may return to employment. You mentioned furloughing, and of course that's up to 7.5 million. That's a much greater concern because, of course, there tend to be people in established employment who've been put, this scheme was a sort of temporary measure to deal with a spike or what would have been a very rapid rise in unemployment. The concern is that sort of many of these businesses may not return. They may simply go bankrupt, and we've seen that this morning. Again, Antler, which some of us may have used if you wanted expensive apparel for your holidays. In terms of cases, they've gone into administration. We hear this about sort of Bella Pasta. And I'm just trying to think, there was another sort of Bella Pasta. Who else was it? Oh, Café Rouge. So there are going to be difficulties, and of course the big concern is that sort of a large proportion, or a sort of significant proportion, of those workers who are furloughed do not return to employment, and we end up with perhaps 10% unemployed by the end of the year, and that could take quite a while to sort of get back down. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we will get back to normality, but it could be 2-3 years, and who knows, we could be even sort of going into the next election still sort of facing sort of some of the consequences of what's happened this year.
So research by the Resolution Foundation claims that young people are most likely to have lost work or seen their income drop because of COVID-19. More than 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds are earning less than before the outbreak. So how do you think this could impact young people long term?
Well, there is no doubt that I mentioned a couple of moments ago the unemployment crises of the sort of the 1970s and 80s, but that was different because that was the decline in traditional industries, which was undoubtedly shocking. And of course, they tend to be sort of people who are older. In case they would have got redundancy payments and the like, but in many parts of the country that there's never been a full recovery. What we've had in recent years is, of course, the sort of the 0-hour contracts and sort of the temporary contracts, the rise of the so-called precariat, and of course they tend to be jobs in the sort of the industries or parts or sectors where it is younger people, hospitality and leisure. So people who've perhaps left school, college, university, even, and worked in these existences. Now, of course, the fact is that if you stall your economy for reasons which we all fully understand, they're the people who are going to lose their employment. As I would keep stressing, the hope is that sort of in any return to normality, these people sort of they resume where they were a couple of months ago, or certainly prior to sort of the outbreak of COVID-19. What I would hope perhaps in an aspirational way is that we move away from this sense of sort of people being in precarious existence, because it's not good for them, it's not good for the economy, and we move back towards a situation, dare I say, in the sort of the 1960s and 70s, where people tend to be on sort of full-time contracts because it's good for them and they can plan their lives. Because of course it's very hard to sort of to make to have hopes and dreams and all the aspirations if you don't know if you're going to be employed from week to week, in some cases day to day. It's pretty dreadful. So and what we do hope, that the government turn their attention to is to sort of to not creating what's known as a lost generation of people who enter into unemployment after sort of to school or university, and then of course it becomes endemic and they perhaps never sort of work. And that's pretty dreadful.
Thanks for joining us, Steve.